In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe neared its conclusion, Central Europe remained unsettled. The Prague Offensive, conducted between 6 and 11 May 1945, was the last major military action undertaken by the Red Army during the Second World War. The campaign unfolded after the fall of Berlin and Germany's official surrender on 8 May, yet it was driven by both military necessity and political calculation. The geopolitical background was shaped by the disintegration of the Third Reich and the rapid reconfiguration of post-war Europe. In April 1945, Soviet forces had stormed Berlin, and Hitler's suicide on 30th April symbolized the collapse of German central authority. However, large German formations remained in the field, particularly in many of these units were retreating from the east and south, seeking to avoid Soviet capture, and instead surrender to Western Allied forces advancing from Germany and Austria. Czechoslovakia itself was strategically and politically significant. Prague was the last major European capital under German control, and the surrounding territory provided routes into Bavaria and Austria. Control of Prague was therefore vital to both the German military and the Allies. For Germany, it offered a temporary refuge for withdrawing troops and a bargaining position in surrender negotiations. For the Soviet Union, it represented the elimination of the last German field army on the Eastern Front and the consolidation of influence in Central Europe. The Soviet Union, aware of the significance, assigned the task of capturing Prague to the 1st Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev, the 2nd Ukrainian Front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, and the 4th Ukrainian Front under General Andrei Yeremenko. Together, these forces numbered over 2 million men, with more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 16,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and 3,000 aircraft. The operation was coordinated with the Czechoslovak First Army Corps, partisan groups, and the local resistance movement in Prague, which had begun an uprising on 5th May. Public sentiment in Czechoslovakia was volatile. The Czech resistance had grown increasingly active in the spring of 1945, anticipating the arrival of Allied troops. The Prague uprising, launched by the Czech National Council, aimed to liberate the capital before either German reprisals or a delayed Allied entry. Civilians armed with captured weapons and improvised barricades clashed with German garrisons in the city. While morale was high among resistance fighters, the uprising risked brutal suppression if external support did not arrive quickly. On the German side, the situation was marked by desperation. Schörner, known for his strict discipline, sought to maintain order within Army Group Center, but many German units were already attempting to negotiate localized surrenders with the Americans. While some commanders hoped to reach U.S. lines in western Bohemia, others prepared to defend against the advancing Soviets. This disunity complicated the German defense of Prague, as troops were torn between orders to resist and the instinct for survival. Thus, the preconditions of the Prague Offensive combined a collapsing German military structure, a determined Soviet push for final victory and political consolidation, and a local uprising in Prague that added urgency to events. The stage was set for a campaign that would not only conclude the Red Army's wartime operations in Europe, but also shape the political settlement in Czechoslovakia for years to come. On 6th May 1945, the Soviet Union opened the Prague Offensive, deploying the combined might of 3 major fronts to strike at Army Group Center in Czechoslovakia. Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front advanced from the north, pushing through Saxony into Bohemia. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front moved from the southeast, crossing the Morava River and driving toward Brno and Olomouc. General Andrei Yeremenko's 4th Ukrainian Front pressed from the northeast, aiming to cut off German escape routes into Austria. Together, their movements formed a pincer designed to encircle and destroy the last major German force still intact on the Eastern Front. The initial advances were rapid. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, under General Pavel Rybalko, spearheaded the northern thrust from Dresden toward Prague, covering nearly 40 kilometers on the first day. Simultaneously, units of the 6th Guards Tank Army under General Andrei Kravchenko advanced westward, supported by the 53rd Army and the 1st Guards Cavalry Mechanized Group. Soviet aviation provided continuous cover, with the 2nd Air Army flying hundreds of sorties against German troop concentrations, bridges, and road convoys retreating toward Bavaria. German reactions reflected the disintegration of Central Command. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner attempted to organize a defense around fortified towns and river barriers, ordering divisions of the 4th Panzer Army and remnants of the 17th Army to resist. However, many commanders disregarded his instructions, seeking instead to march westward to surrender to American forces. German records describe confusion as entire regiments abandoned positions, while isolated units continued fighting under fragmented orders. In Prague itself, the uprising begun on 5 May intensified. Czech partisans, numbering tens of thousands, erected barricades, seized radio stations, and attacked German garrisons. The Prague radio broadcast appeals for assistance, calling on both the Red Army and Western Allies to intervene. German troops in the city, estimated at around 30,000, responded with artillery and armored vehicles, targeting resistance positions. The violence escalated into open street battles, with civilians caught in the crossfire. The uprising created urgency for the advancing Soviets. Reports from the Czech National Council emphasized the danger of German reprisals if reinforcements did not arrive quickly. Konev ordered his tank armies to accelerate their march, reducing rest periods and pushing through night operations. This decision placed additional strain on fuel and supply columns, but reflected the political and humanitarian imperative to reach Prague before the uprising was crushed. Meanwhile, American forces under General George Patton's Third Army advanced into western Czechoslovakia, reaching Plzeň on 6 May. However, orders from Supreme Allied Command restricted them from moving further east, in accordance with agreements reached at Yalta. This limitation left the liberation of Prague to the Red Army, despite the geographical proximity of U.S. units. The Czech resistance, aware of the Allied boundary, nevertheless maintained contact with both American and Soviet commanders, hoping for coordination. By the evening of 6 May, the opening phase of the Soviet operation had achieved substantial territorial gains. German defenses were collapsing in multiple sectors, and the Red Army was advancing on a broad front toward Prague. Yet the battle was far from over. The task of encircling and destroying Army Group Center required coordinated maneuvers across difficult terrain, while the uprising in Prague, the strategic goals and planning of the Prague Offensive, revealed both the military logic of the final Soviet push into Central Europe and the political considerations shaping operations in May 1945. Unlike earlier offensives, which aimed to break the back of German resistance across vast fronts, this campaign unfolded in the context of Germany's surrender already being negotiated. It was therefore not only a military action, but also a race to secure influence in the heart of Europe. From the Soviet perspective, the primary military objective was the destruction of Army Group Center. With an estimated 900,000 men, more than 9,000 guns and mortars, and approximately 1,100 tanks and assault guns, this force remained a formidable opponent even if cohesion was breaking down. Its position in Bohemia threatened Soviet supply lines in Poland and Austria, and it represented the last organized German army capable of conducting large-scale operations. If it were allowed to retreat intact and surrender to the Americans, it could deny the Soviets a major victory and alter the post-war balance of power in Czechoslovakia. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front bore the main burden of the northern thrust. His forces included the 3rd Guards Tank Army, the 4th Guards Tank Army, and the 13th and 28th Armies, supported by strong artillery and air units. Their task was to push southwest from Saxony, cross the Elbe tributaries, and advance rapidly toward Prague. To ensure speed, Konev emphasized mechanized exploitation and night operations, even at the cost of higher logistical strain. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front was tasked with advancing from the southeast, with the 6th Guards Tank Army the 53rd Army, and the 7th Guards Army forming its spearheads. Their orders were to strike across Moravia, capturing Brno and Olomouc before turning west. This advance was designed not only to envelop German forces, but also to link up with Konev's armies in the Prague Basin. General Andrei Yeremenko's 4th Ukrainian Front, attacking from Slovakia, was to move through the Carpathian foothills and cut German escape routes into Austria, while simultaneously supporting partisan activity in northern Moravia. The Soviets also integrated naval and air power into their planning. Although far from the sea, the operation relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance and close air support. The 2nd and 5th Air Armies allocated more than 3,000 aircraft to suppress German movement by day, destroying bridges and disrupting retreat routes. Supply was another central concern. To maintain momentum, the Red Army stockpiled fuel and ammunition in forward depots, while mobile repair units followed armored spearheads to keep vehicles operational during the long marches. German planning was less coherent, reflecting the collapse of Central Command. Schörner's orders to Army Group Center emphasized holding defensive lines around Prague to prevent Soviet entry. He hoped to maintain a zone of resistance in Bohemia that could serve as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the Allies. However, Hitler's death and the subsequent surrender of the Reich High Command created confusion. Many German generals, recognizing that the war was lost, aimed to preserve their men by retreating west to surrender to American forces, rather than face Soviet captivity. This divergence of objectives fractured German command, with some divisions attempting to hold positions, while others disengaged and marched westward. Logistics further undermined German planning. By May 1945, fuel shortages crippled the mobility of armored units. Tank battalions often abandoned vehicles due to lack of fuel, reducing their capacity to resist Soviet mechanized thrusts. Ammunition stocks were depleted, and air support was minimal. The Luftwaffe in Central Europe had fewer than 200 operational aircraft, mostly fighters, which could not challenge Soviet air superiority. German reliance on defensive terrain and improvised obstacles could delay, but not stop the Soviet advance. Propaganda played a crucial role for both sides. Soviet media framed the Prague Offensive as the final liberation of Czechoslovakia and a continuation of the victories at Berlin and Vienna. Messages were broadcast to Czech partisans promising imminent support and urging continued resistance. German propaganda, conversely, focused on the danger of Soviet occupation, encouraging soldiers to fight westward to reach American lines. This narrative resonated with many German units, reinforcing the disunity within Army Group Center as troops prioritized escape over coordinated defense. The uprising in Prague added urgency to strategic planning. The Czech National Council's appeal for help was not ignored. Soviet commanders accelerated timetables to relieve the city before it was crushed by German reprisals. The uprising forced the Red Army to treat Prague not only as an operational objective, but also as a political symbol. Capturing the city quickly would demonstrate Soviet protection of liberation movements and solidify Moscow's influence in Czechoslovakia's post-war future. Thus, the strategic goals and planning of the Prague Offensive combined military, logistical, and political dimensions. The Soviets sought to annihilate Army Group Center, secure Prague, and demonstrate their power to allies and liberated populations. The Germans attempted, with diminishing success, to maintain order long enough to escape westward. Both sides understood that the operation's outcome would shape not only the end of the war, but also the political landscape of Central Europe in the years that followed. The first engagements of the Prague Offensive unfolded between 7 and 9 May 1945, as the Red Army's advancing fronts clashed with the German rearguards across Saxony, Moravia, and Bohemia. These battles demonstrated the contrasting states of the two armies. Soviet forces moved with overwhelming momentum, while the German Army Group Center struggled to maintain cohesion amid crumbling command structures and competing objectives. On 7 May, Soviet spearheads from Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front crossed into northern Bohemia. The 3rd Guards Tank Army advanced through the Ore Mountains, overcoming hastily prepared German strongpoints. These included units of the 4th Panzer Army, which attempted to block Soviet progress, with remnants of armored battalions and Volkssturm detachments. Fighting in towns such as Teplis and Most was intense but brief. German forces often withdrew rather than risk encirclement, leaving behind burned vehicles and abandoned equipment. Further east, Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front pressed forward into Moravia. The 6th Guards Tank Army, supported by rifle divisions, bypassed isolated pockets of resistance around Olomouc and pushed toward the Moravian Gate. German formations, including remnants of the 1st Panzer Army, attempted counterattacks using small groups of tanks and assault guns. These were repelled with heavy losses as Soviet artillery and anti-tank weapons dominated the battlefield. Prisoners captured in these encounters reported low morale, dwindling fuel, and a widespread determination among soldiers to march west to surrender to American forces rather than continue fighting. Yeremenko's 4th Ukrainian Front encountered tougher resistance in the Carpathian foothills, where terrain favored German delay. Units of the 97th Rifle Corps fought through minefields and ambushes, with progress measured in kilometers rather than tens of kilometers. Still, by 9th of May, Soviet troops had broken through to the Slovak borderlands, threatening to cut off German units retreating toward Austria. Meanwhile, inside Prague, the uprising intensified. Czech partisans expanded their control over neighborhoods, manning more than 1,600 barricades across the city. German garrisons responded with artillery and armored vehicles, inflicting hundreds of civilian casualties. On 8 May, German negotiators briefly discussed terms with the Czech National Council, agreeing to withdraw from the city if allowed safe passage west. However, the agreement collapsed when Soviet forces approached, and fighting resumed with greater ferocity. The presence of Waffen-SS units in the city. The wider German position deteriorated rapidly as news of Germany's unconditional surrender, signed at Reims on 7 May and ratified in Berlin on 8 May, reached frontline units. While officially hostilities were to cease on 8-9 May, Schörner's Army Group Center largely ignored or delayed implementation of the order. Many commanders ordered their men to keep marching west, fearing Soviet captivity. This led to chaotic scenes in Bohemia, with columns of troops, vehicles, and civilians jamming roads toward the American lines near Plzeň and Karlovy Vary. Soviet aircraft bombed and strafed these columns, adding to the confusion. Soviet advances accelerated accordingly. Tank armies covered up to 60 kilometers per day, bypassing major resistance and focusing on reaching Prague before German troops could retreat fully. By the evening of 8 May, Soviet vanguards were less than 50 kilometers from the capital, while partisans. On 19 May at dawn, Soviet forward units entered Prague. Elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army rolled into the city, greeted by partisans and civilians. Fighting continued in pockets, especially against Waffen-SS detachments that refused to surrender. Several hundred Soviet soldiers and partisans were killed during these final clashes. The first engagements of the offensive thus produced a rapid collapse of organized German resistance, though at the cost of localized, bitter fighting. The speed of the Soviet advance prevented Schörner from executing an orderly withdrawal of his entire force. Instead, parts of Army Group Center were trapped east of Prague, while others fled west in disorder. The Prague uprising, which might have been crushed without outside intervention, survived long enough for Soviet tanks to secure the city. In this way, the early battles marked both the operational success of the Red Army and the beginning of the end for German forces still fighting in Czechoslovakia. As the Prague Offensive entered its decisive stage between 9 and 11 May 1945, escalation defined the course of events both on the battlefield and within the crumbling German command structure. Despite Germany's unconditional surrender taking effect on the night of 8 to 9 May, fighting did not immediately cease in Czechoslovakia. Instead, the offensive intensified, with Soviet troops racing to secure Prague and encircle German formations, while Army Group Center sought desperately to escape westward. The result was a paradoxical continuation of large-scale combat even after the official end of the war in Europe. On 9th of May, the Red Army's armored spearheads pushed into Prague itself. The 3rd Guards Tank Army under General Rybalko led the way, supported by units of the 13th. By dawn, Soviet tanks entered the city from the north and east, linking up with partisan barricades that had resisted German troops for days. Fighting inside Prague continued into the evening as Waffen SS units and rearguard detachments engaged in street battles. Approximately 10,000 German troops remained in the city at the time of Soviet entry, many of them from SS and police formations unwilling to surrender. Clashes left hundreds dead on both sides before organized resistance collapsed. Beyond Prague, the scale of the confrontation grew as Soviet fronts pressed to encircle German columns retreating west. Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front advanced along the Dresden-Prague axis, cutting the main roads through the Ore Mountains. Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front moved northwest from Brno, while Yeremenko's 4th Ukrainian Front advanced from Slovakia to block escape routes into Austria. Together, these movements created a massive pincer around Bohemia, threatening to trap Army Group Center's remnants. By 10th of May, Soviet forces had closed many of the corridors leading toward American lines, capturing thousands of stragglers. The Germans attempted to respond with improvised measures. Schörner issued orders on 9 of May directing his units to fight their way west at all costs. The 4th Panzer Army, reduced to a fraction of its former strength, used its remaining armored vehicles in rearguard actions, particularly around Kolin and Pardubice. The 1st Panzer Army, retreating from Moravia, fought delaying battles on the approaches to Prague, while elements of the 7th and 8th Armies became entangled in civilian columns of refugees. German resistance was uneven. Some units surrendered en masse, while others fought on in the hope of buying time to reach the American zone. The situation was complicated by the presence of civilians. As German troops retreated, they were joined by tens of thousands of refugees, including ethnic Germans, officials, and collaborators, all seeking to avoid Soviet capture. Columns of carts, vehicles, and livestock clogged the roads, slowing military movement. Soviet air units targeted these columns, aiming to disrupt German withdrawal, but this also increased civilian casualties. The humanitarian crisis deepened as villages and towns along the retreat routes became overcrowded with displaced persons. For the Soviets, the escalation created logistical and operational challenges. Rapid advances placed heavy strain on fuel and ammunition supplies, and the destruction of bridges and roads slowed the movement of artillery and supply convoys. Nevertheless, Soviet commanders prioritized speed, directing tank and cavalry mechanized groups to bypass resistance and cut off retreat routes. By 11 May, Rybalko's tanks had pushed well beyond Prague, linking with Malinovsky's forces to encircle large German formations east of Plzeň. International politics also played a role in this phase of escalation. The Western Allies, adhering to previously agreed demarcation lines, did not move beyond Plzeň. American commanders declined to advance further east, despite appeals from Czech leaders, leaving the Red Army to complete the operation. This reinforced the Soviet determination to move quickly, ensuring that Prague and most of Bohemia were liberated by Soviet rather than Western forces. Casualties in these final days were significant. Soviet records indicate that the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts lost several thousand men in combat after 9 May, while German losses are estimated at more than 40,000 killed or captured during the retreat and encirclement battles. The disintegration of Army Group Center was accelerated but the fighting was prolonged by the determination of certain German units, particularly SS divisions, to resist capture. By the close of 11th of May, the escalation of the Prague Offensive had transformed the remnants of the German army in Bohemia into disorganized groups of prisoners. The Red Army secured Prague and surrounding areas, while Schörner himself abandoned his command, fleeing to the west. The last major battle of the Eastern Front had ended not with a negotiated surrender in the field, but with a rapid series of clashes, encirclements, and retreats that continued days after Germany's formal capitulation. The escalation phase revealed the chaotic intersection of military collapse, political boundaries, and human desperation that marked the war's final moments in Central Europe. Between 10 and 12 May 1945, the Prague Offensive reached its peak, both in terms of the scale of combat and the human drama surrounding the final battles of the Eastern Front. Although Germany's unconditional surrender had already been signed, the fighting in Bohemia continued as one of the last and largest military operations in Europe. The Red Army poured enormous resources into the drive, determined to encircle Army Group Center before it could escape westward, while German formations, desperate to avoid Soviet captivity, fought with intensity despite the hopelessness of their position. Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front carried the weight of the central assault. His 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies advanced rapidly through Bohemia, using speed and overwhelming numbers to bypass resistance and close escape routes. Infantry divisions followed closely, supported by heavy artillery barrages that pulverized German blocking positions along roads and towns. Simultaneously, Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front advanced from the southeast, its 6th Guards tank army linking with Rybalko's armor to trap German columns near Pardubice. Yeremenko's 4th Ukrainian Front pressed from Slovakia, clearing the Carpathian foothills and blocking southern avenues of retreat. In total, more than 2 million Soviet soldiers participated in the operation at its peak, supported by over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 16,000 artillery pieces, and 3,000 aircraft. German resistance during these days came primarily from rearguard detachments, many composed of Waffen-SS units and remnants of panzer divisions. The 4th Panzer Army, despite being reduced to fewer than 150 operational tanks and assault guns, staged delaying actions around towns like Radek Králové and Kolín. These rearguards often fought tenaciously, inflicting Soviet casualties before withdrawing westward. Reports describe columns of thousands of German soldiers abandoning weapons, mixing with refugees, and attempting to cross into the American zone near Plzeň. The result was a chaotic battlefield, where pockets of fierce resistance existed alongside masses of surrendering or retreating troops. The fighting inside Prague itself also reached a climax during this period. By 9 May, Soviet spearheads had entered the city, but mopping up operations against SS and police units continued for 2 more days. Barricades built by partisans were integrated into Soviet positions, while street battles raged in districts where German troops refused to surrender. Artillery duels shattered residential areas, and casualties among civilians mounted. Soviet records indicate more than 1,600 partisans and civilians were killed during the uprising and its aftermath, while several thousand German defenders were captured or killed before the city was fully secured. Air operations intensified during the peak of the offensive. The 2nd and 5th Air Armies flew continuous sorties, targeting bridges, road junctions, and retreating German convoys. IL-2 Sturmovik aircraft strafed columns of vehicles along the Bohemian highways, while bombers struck concentrations of troops near Plzeň and České Budějovice. With the Luftwaffe virtually absent, Soviet air power operated with impunity, accelerating the collapse of organized German movement. However, the bombardments also caused heavy losses among civilians trapped in mixed refugee and military convoys, underscoring the humanitarian toll of the campaign's final days. Civilian suffering reached its highest point during this stage. Tens of thousands of refugees, many ethnic Germans and collaborators, moved westward in overcrowded convoys. Roads became jammed with horse-drawn carts, wagons, and vehicles, slowing German military withdrawal and making the columns vulnerable to Soviet airstrikes. Food shortages, disease, and exposure to early summer rains compounded the hardship. Meanwhile, Czech civilians in liberated areas faced reprisals against suspected collaborators and the destruction left by retreating German forces. The humanitarian crisis, unfolding alongside the combat, was one of the most severe in Central Europe at the war's end. Politically, the peak of the offensive coincided with the uneasy interaction between the Allies. American forces, halted at Plzeň by Supreme Allied Command orders, received surrendering German columns but did not advance further east. This created a clear demarcation line. Soviet troops were to liberate Prague and most of Bohemia, while the Americans remained in western Czechoslovakia. German soldiers recognized this boundary and concentrated their efforts on reaching American captivity, further intensifying clashes with Soviet blocking forces. By 11-12 May, the peak had been reached. Soviet forces had closed multiple encirclements east of Plzeň, capturing tens of thousands of German troops. Some estimates place the total number of German prisoners taken during the operation at over 860,000, though this included large numbers of soldiers who surrendered without resistance. The Red Army lost tens of thousands of men killed or wounded in the final battles, reflecting the scale and intensity of combat even in the war's final days. The Prague Offensive's peak demonstrated both the Soviet Union's capacity for massive, coordinated operations and the desperation of a defeated German army fighting to avoid captivity. It was an operation conducted with the full weight of Soviet military power, yet also shaped by political boundaries, refugee movements, and the collapse of German authority. These final, intense battles symbolized the closing chapter of the Eastern Front, fought not for conquest alone, but to deter. As the fighting in Bohemia reached its concluding days, resistance and adaptation became the defining features of both the Soviet and German experiences in the Prague Offensive. By mid-May 1945, the broader war in Europe was over. Yet combat persisted across Czechoslovakia, marked by desperate rearguards, rapid tactical improvisation, and the mobilization of local resistance movements that sought to influence the outcome of liberation. For the Germans, resistance took the form of fragmented but often determined delaying actions. Army Group Center, though already collapsing, retained substantial manpower. Schörner's officers ordered formations such as the 4th Panzer Army and remnants of the 1st Panzer Army to fight holding battles in the hope of gaining time for westward withdrawal. In practice, this meant small detachments of tanks, assault guns, and these tactics slowed the Soviet pursuit enough to allow larger German columns, sometimes numbering tens of thousands of men, to march westward. The adaptation was evident in how German units reorganized on the move, often abandoning heavy equipment to preserve mobility, turning to bicycles, horse-drawn wagons, or simply marching on foot. Soviet forces adapted their approach accordingly. Recognizing the German focus on escape rather than static defense, Konev and Malinovsky prioritized encirclement over frontal assaults. Mobile groups composed of tank and cavalry mechanized corps were dispatched ahead of the main armies to block key crossroads and valleys. Infantry divisions followed to clear resistance and secure lines of communication. Soviet commanders also relied heavily on partisans for intelligence. Czech and Slovak resistance fighters reported German troop movements, guided Soviet columns through local terrain, and sabotaged bridges or telegraph lines to disrupt enemy coordination. This integration of local knowledge into Red Army planning marked a critical adaptation in the final pursuit. Resistance in Prague and across Bohemia also came from civilians themselves. The Prague uprising had mobilized tens of thousands of ordinary people who continued to support Soviet troops once they arrived in the city on 90 May. Partisans manned barricades, guarded prisoners, and patrolled neighborhoods to prevent the return of German troops. In rural areas, resistance groups disrupted German convoys, captured stragglers, and secured supplies. These movements had limited military capacity compared to regular armies, but they played a key role in ensuring that liberated areas did not slip back into German control during the chaotic retreat. The adaptation of logistics was another crucial element. The Red Army, advancing at remarkable speed across devastated terrain, faced shortages of fuel and ammunition. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly to repair bridges destroyed by German demolitions, often building makeshift wooden structures under fire. Supply units resorted to using captured German trucks, horse teams, and even requisitioned civilian carts to move rations and shells forward. The Germans, for their part, faced the inverse problem: too many vehicles and too little fuel. Panzer units abandoned tanks and half-tracks en masse, while soldiers carried only light weapons as they marched toward American lines. This contrast in logistical adaptation reflected the opposing strategic priorities: Soviet forces pushing forward at all costs, Germans retreating as lightly burdened as possible. Psychological resistance and adaptation were also evident. Among German troops, morale was fragmented. Some fought with determination, especially Waffen-SS units that feared Soviet captivity, while others surrendered at the first opportunity. Among Soviet soldiers, morale was high due to the prospect of imminent victory, yet fatigue and casualties continued to weigh heavily. Letters and reports from the front described both pride in liberating Prague and frustration at the prolonged fighting after Germany's official surrender. For Czech civilians, the adaptation was one of survival, shifting from clandestine resistance to open collaboration with Soviet forces while coping with the devastation of war and reprisals against collaborators. By 12th May, resistance from German forces had dwindled into scattered firefights, with Soviet mobile groups cutting off the last escape routes and partisans rounding up stragglers. The Red Army had adapted to the fluid battlefield by relying on speed, intelligence, and local support, while the Germans resisted just long enough to allow some of their forces to cross into American captivity. This stage of the offensive illustrated not only the military dynamics of the final Eastern Front battle, but also the broader human capacity for adaptation under the most extreme circumstances of war's end. The turning point of the Prague Offensive emerged between 10 and 12 May 1945, when the Red Army successfully closed the encirclement around the remnants of Army Group Center, and the last major formations of the Wehrmacht in Central Europe ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Unlike earlier turning points on the Eastern Front, which were marked by dramatic single battles, the shift in Bohemia was gradual and operational. The balance tipped irreversibly as Soviet mobile groups cut escape corridors, Prague was secured, and German forces were left with no option but surrender or capture. One of the decisive moments occurred on 9 to 10 May, when Soviet tank armies from the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts linked near Pardubice and cut the main road system leading from Prague toward Plzeň. This maneuver isolated tens of thousands of German troops still east of Prague, including elements of the 4th Panzer Army. At the same time, Yeremenko's 4th Ukrainian Front sealed approaches through the Carpathians, preventing escape into Austria. By 11th May, the encirclement was complete. Army Group Center was fragmented into pockets scattered across Bohemia, unable to mount coordinated resistance. Inside Prague, the situation crystallized even more clearly. When Soviet tanks entered the city on 9th of May, the Prague uprising shifted from desperate resistance to consolidation. Waffen-SS detachments that continued to fight were gradually eliminated, and by 11th May, the capital was firmly under Soviet and partisan control. The liberation of Prague was both a symbolic and practical turning point. The last major European capital under German occupation had fallen, and with it the central political objective of the offensive was achieved. German commanders recognized the collapse. Schörner, unwilling to face capture, abandoned his army and flew to surrender in the American zone on 10th of May, leaving his troops leaderless. His departure marked the effective disintegration of Army Group Center. Without central command, German divisions dissolved. The abandonment of leadership was as decisive as battlefield defeats, signaling to soldiers that resistance was futile. For the Soviets, the turning point was reinforced by the political outcome of the operation. Despite the official German surrender signed at Reims and Berlin, the Red Army had demonstrated that it alone possessed the power to destroy the last intact Wehrmacht army. By securing Prague and capturing more than 600,000 prisoners over the course of the operation, the Soviets ensured that Central Europe would not host a prolonged German holdout, nor would Western allies have the opportunity to claim liberation of Czechoslovakia's capital. This established Soviet authority in post-war Czechoslovakia and cemented Moscow's role in shaping the region's political trajectory. For civilians, the turning point was marked by both relief and devastation. In Prague, the entry of Soviet troops prevented the uprising from being crushed, saving thousands of lives. In rural Bohemia and Moravia, however, the encirclement battles left behind destruction as German units burned villages to cover their retreat, and Soviet artillery hammered towns sheltering rearguards. Refugees who had fled west found themselves trapped between advancing Soviet columns and unyielding American lines. For many, the turning point meant the end of hope for safe passage. Capture by the Soviets became unavoidable. The operational climax also highlighted the contrasting conditions of the two armies. The Red Army, despite exhaustion, retained overwhelming superiority in manpower and materiel. Soviet tank and mechanized corps advanced 40-60 kilometers per day, outpacing German retreat. German forces, reduced by fuel shortages and breakdowns, abandoned more than 1,000 armored vehicles and countless artillery pieces. Encirclement meant that equipment losses could no longer be replaced, and resistance degenerated. The turning point was therefore not only territorial, but also logistical. The Germans simply no longer had the capacity to continue. By the evening of 12th of May, the turning point had become irreversible. German formations were surrendering in mass numbers. Prague was secure, and Soviet troops controlled the Bohemian Basin. The Wehrmacht's last major army in the east had ceased to exist as an organized force. The Prague Offensive, though launched after Germany's surrender elsewhere, thus concluded with a decisive shift that symbolized the very end of the Eastern Front, the collapse of German resistance, the final Soviet victory, and the beginning of a new political order in Central Europe. The aftermath of the Prague Offensive unfolded in the days immediately following 12th May 1945, when the Red Army completed its operations in Bohemia and the remnants of Army Group Center either surrendered or disintegrated. Though the war in Europe had formally ended with Germany's unconditional capitulation on 8th May, the fighting around Prague demonstrated how the collapse of a great army did not occur neatly or in perfect synchronization with political declarations. The consequences of the campaign were felt across military, civilian, and political spheres, leaving behind devastation, but also a sense of finality to 6 years of total war. For the Soviets, the conclusion of the offensive was marked by the capture of immense numbers of prisoners. By mid-May, over 600,000 German soldiers from Army Group Center were in Soviet custody, representing one of the largest mass capitulations of the war. Among these were personnel from the 4th Panzer Army, the 17th Army, and remnants of the 1st Panzer Army, as well as assorted Waffen-SS divisions. Captured equipment included more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns, thousands of artillery pieces, and vast amounts of transport vehicles, most of them abandoned due to fuel shortages or destroyed during the retreat. This sudden influx of prisoners created logistical challenges for the Red Army, which had to organize transport and camps across already strained lines of communication. German forces that managed to reach American lines were treated differently. Around 200,000 soldiers crossed into U.S. custody near Plzeň and Karlovy Vary, where they surrendered without further fighting. This divergence between Soviet and American zones of captivity became a contentious issue in the immediate post-war weeks, as both sides exchanged prisoners according to Allied agreements. For many German soldiers, the difference between surrendering to the Soviets or Americans carried life or death implications, given the harsher conditions expected in Soviet camps. For civilians in Prague, the aftermath meant liberation, but also immense destruction. The city bore the scars of street fighting and bombardments. Barricades still lined major thoroughfares, and many buildings were damaged by shell fire. Casualty estimates suggest that at least 1,600 Czech partisans and civilians died during the uprising and its suppression, with thousands more wounded. Yet the relief of surviving German withdrawal was palpable. The Czech National Council emerged from the underground to assume temporary authority, though its decisions were closely monitored by the Soviet military command. Across the countryside, civilians faced the challenge of rebuilding towns destroyed by scorched earth tactics and recovering from shortages of food and shelter after years of occupation. In Finnmark and Norway earlier in 1944, scorched earth retreat had become still. Many villages along retreat routes were burned, bridges demolished, and infrastructure destroyed. Refugee columns that had clogged roads during the offensive now dispersed. Some civilians returned home, while others were detained as suspected collaborators. Ethnic Germans living in Czechoslovakia faced hostility from local populations, foreshadowing the mass expulsions that would take place in the months ahead. Politically, the aftermath of the Prague Offensive solidified Soviet influence in Czechoslovakia. The Red Army's role in liberating Prague was undeniable, especially given that American forces had halted at Plzeň. This positioned Moscow to shape the post-war government, working with the Czech Communist Party and ensuring that the memory of the uprising was intertwined with Soviet assistance. The Western Allies respected the demarcation lines agreed upon earlier, meaning that the Soviets retained sole credit for ending German occupation of the Czech capital. Internationally, the operation underscored both cooperation and tension within the Allied coalition. While Americans and Soviets coordinated prisoner exchanges, disputes arose over the treatment of civilians and the future administration of Czechoslovakia. The Prague Offensive thus served as one of the first arenas in which wartime alliance gave way to post-war rivalry, as the military balance translated into political positioning. The humanitarian consequences of the aftermath were severe. Tens of thousands of German prisoners began long marches eastward toward camps in the Soviet Union. Conditions were harsh, with food shortages and exposure claiming additional lives even after the fighting had ended. Czech civilians faced the task of caring for displaced persons and rebuilding devastated infrastructure. Relief began to arrive gradually, with Allied aid agencies distributing food and medicine, but shortages persisted well into 1946. By the end of May 1945, organized combat had ceased entirely in Czechoslovakia. The last scattered German groups surrendered or were rounded up by partisans. The Red Army consolidated its positions across the country, while the Czech Provisional Government was established under Soviet supervision. For soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike, the aftermath of the Prague Offensive represented both the close of the Second World War in Europe and the uncertain beginning of a new geopolitical order. The campaign had ended in victory for the Red Army, disaster for the Wehrmacht, and liberation for Czechoslovakia, but it also left behind deep scars that would shape Central Europe in the years to follow. The legacy of the Prague Offensive was complex and far-reaching, extending beyond the immediate military outcome into the political and cultural frameworks of post-war Europe. As the final large-scale Soviet operation of the Second World War, it symbolized both the culmination of the Red Army's immense effort on the Eastern Front and the transition toward a new geopolitical landscape defined by occupation zones, ideological competition, and memory politics. Militarily, the offensive demonstrated the Soviet capacity to mount coordinated operations even at the very end of a prolonged war. With more than 2 million troops engaged, supported by over 6,000 tanks and 3,000 aircraft, the Red Army executed one of its most rapid advances, covering nearly 200 kilometers in less than a week. The destruction of Army Group Center removed the last major German field formation in Europe. Approximately 860,000 German soldiers were captured by the Soviets during the operation, while another 200,000 reached American custody. These figures confirm the scale of German collapse and underline the Soviet achievement in neutralizing an entire army group after the Reich's formal surrender. Yet the campaign also highlighted the persistence of fighting even after political decisions had supposedly ended the war, underscoring the chaotic conditions of Germany's disintegration. Politically, the legacy of the offensive was inseparable from the future of Czechoslovakia. By liberating Prague and controlling most of Bohemia, the Soviet Union positioned itself as the dominant external influence in the country. The Czechoslovak Communist Party, though not yet fully in power, benefited from the prestige of Soviet victory. The Prague Uprising, which began before Soviet arrival, was interpreted in different ways. Locally, it was seen as a demonstration of national determination. Internationally, Soviet narratives emphasized that only Red Army intervention secured the final liberation. These competing interpretations shaped post-war memory and became central to Cold War propaganda. The Western Allies, though involved indirectly, also left their mark on the legacy. The American decision not to advance beyond Plzeň was rooted in agreements at Yalta and reflected the emerging division of Europe. To Czech civilians in the West, U.S. troops symbolized liberation, while in Prague and the East, the Soviets were celebrated. This duality created a layered memory of the war in Czechoslovakia, one that balanced gratitude to both Allied camps, but was soon overshadowed by the realities of Soviet dominance in the political sphere. Culturally, the Prague Offensive monuments were erected in Prague and other cities to honor Soviet soldiers, embedding the operation in the symbolic landscape of liberation. In Czechoslovakia, remembrance was more nuanced. While the liberation of Prague was celebrated, the heavy civilian toll, the destruction of towns and villages, and the humanitarian crisis of displaced persons left difficult legacies. During the communist era, official narratives emphasized Soviet heroism, while the independent role of the Czech resistance was minimized. After 1989, historical reinterpretation sought to restore balance by recognizing both local agency and the cost of Soviet influence. For Germany, the legacy was one of defeat and disintegration. The collapse of Army Group Center demonstrated the impossibility of continued resistance and the futility of attempts to escape Soviet encirclement. For German soldiers and civilians who experienced the retreat, the Prague Offensive became associated with destruction, displacement, and captivity. In post-war German memory, the campaign was overshadowed by the surrender at Reims and Berlin, but among veterans it remained a stark reminder of the chaos of final defeat. On a broader scale, the Prague Offensive exemplified how the closing battles of the Second World War were intertwined with the opening chapters of the Cold War. The Soviet decision to halt at the agreed demarcation line, despite the ability to push further west, illustrated both adherence to Allied agreements and confidence that influence over Czechoslovakia had already been secured. The Western Allies, for their part, accepted this division, focusing instead on stabilizing Western Germany and Austria. Thus, in the decades that followed, the offensive was remembered differently across borders. In the Soviet Union and later Russia, it was honored as a decisive final act of liberation. In Czechoslovakia, it was commemorated each May, though with shifting emphasis depending on political climate. In Western historiography, it was often seen as a coda to the war, overshadowed by Berlin, but significant in its demonstration of Soviet strategic reach. Ultimately, the Prague Offensive was more than a military operation. It was the last battle of a global conflict, the liberation of a capital city, and a political statement about the shape of Europe to come. Its legacy endures in archives, memorials, and collective memory, as a reminder of how the war ended not in sudden silence, but in the roar of tanks and artillery advancing into Central Europe, shaping the continent's